G'day! In today's video, we're going to have a look at Stray on Mac and its tech and its performance and so forth. Enjoy. Stray was developed by Blue 12 Studio and published by Annapurna Interactive. First, let's go over tech of Stray on Mac. This is a full DirectX 12 game ported over to the Metal 3 API. I always like to take note of this, as there are still not many DirectX 12 games being ported over to Mac. Stray on Mac also utilizes metal effects, and it looks to be spatial upscaling. Instead of different modes like performance, balanced, and quality, Stray uses a resolution scale option from 200% down to 50%. I suppose in some ways this provides a little more customization on our end to fine-tune performance. To be honest though, I don't really like metal effects in this game due to spatial upscaling. With it enabled, there is ghosting and a blurry image. The worst of it is major ghosting with the cat's fur. Sadly, metal effects is needed here on low-end Macs to improve performance, but if you can, disable it and use the built-in scaling solution of TAA for an overall better image. In many ways, I wish there was an in-game option to disable anti-aliasing, as it's just not very good in this game. Stray is powered by Unreal Engine 4. This engine is known for its high-fidelity graphics, and it shows in Stray. Stray on Mac also obviously has full controller support, with rumble vibration. I'm a little disappointed to see no haptic feedback or adaptive trigger support on DualSense controllers. That being said, these features are a little mediocre on the PS5 version, and I don't believe these features are well supported in Unreal Engine 4 anyway, so not a big issue, but yeah. Before we get into the game's performance, there are two major bugs I want to address for Blue 12 Studio. Stray often freezes on every Mac. Based on my testing, I found this occurs with VSync enabled. This was really annoying and completely ruined the immersion when the game would just freeze for 5 seconds or so. Sometimes the game would completely crash and I'd have to force quit the game. Disabling VSync fixed the problem for me, but screen tearing was quite noticeable, especially on 60Hz displays. It's really noticeable on my M3 iMac. On every single Mac, the game defaults to medium graphics with mesh quality on high when you relaunch the game. Not a big issue, but I thought it was worth mentioning. Now let's go over the game's performance across a range of Apple Silicon Macs. Up first is my MacBook Pro 13-inch with M1. What you're going to notice with every Mac is that the start of the game in chapter Inside the Wall, the performance is very poor. One reason for this could be due to a great deal of high-quality foliage and shadows in the area. At 1080p medium graphics, the FPS is about 19 to 25, basically unplayable. However, once this chapter ends, the performance becomes dramatically better, with up to 40 FPS in some scenes. Here, later on in the rooftops or the sewers chapter, it's about 30 to 40 FPS, much more respectable performance, and what I'd like to see from M1. So is this M1 MacBook Pro capable of 60 FPS? Yes. Kinda. You must play at 900p, then put metal effects to 70% scaling, enable a 60 FPS cap, and put all graphics to medium, but mesh quality to low. Now this provides close to 60 FPS on average in most of the game, with some challenging scenes dropping into the low 50s. These settings will not provide 60 FPS in the first chapter though, Inside the Wall. However, it will make it playable with about 30 FPS. Thankfully, this scene is very short and most of the game sees a much more enjoyable frame rate. Moving on, we have my MacBook Air 15-inch with M2. So is the opening chapter of the game Inside the Wall more playable on this M2 MacBook Air? Well, a little. At 1080p medium graphics, it's about 24 to 30 FPS on this machine. Still not amazing results though. However, once this chapter ends, the performance becomes dramatically better, with up to 50 FPS in some scenes. Here, later on in the rooftops or the sewers chapter, it's about 38 to 50 FPS. The problem is that due to this MacBook Air having no fan, the machine throttles hard, getting up to 50 degrees and more for me, whereas my M1 MacBook Pro was only getting up to 45 degrees at max. So I tried putting a massive fan in front of the MacBook Air to see if it improved performance, and well, it did. Here are some comparisons within the rooftop chapter. So, is this M2 MacBook Air capable of 60 FPS and at 1080p? Not really, sadly. I tried the game at 1080p, put Metal Effects to 70% scaling, enabled a 60 FPS cap, and pulled all graphics to medium, but mesh quality to low. This provides anywhere from 40 to 60 FPS. If we compare this to my 13-inch MacBook Pro with M2, you can see this device is capable of achieving 60 FPS, as it has a fan and doesn't throttle as hard, only going up to about 45 degrees. I once again tried putting my massive fan in front of the MacBook Air, and it improved the results dramatically, providing that 60 FPS target. I would not advise 60 FPS on this machine unless maybe you have some sort of cooling device. Otherwise, I would suggest aiming for 30 FPS at 1080p. This is the same settings with Metal Effects on 70% and all graphics on medium, but mesh quality on low. Even without a fan, the device can achieve this target throughout gameplay, even during the opening part of the game, which, is known to be challenging to run. Up next, we have my iMac 24-inch with M3. This machine can achieve 30 FPS at 1080p medium in the opening chapter Inside the Wall. Blue 12 Studio really need to optimize this opening chapter, but I know it's an issue on Windows PC too. Once this chapter is over, the FPS will jump up to 60 plus FPS at times. Here later on in the rooftops or the sewers chapter, it's about 50 to 60 plus FPS. But what if you want a stable 60 FPS on this machine at 1080p? This is possible with these settings: 1080p, but Metal Effects to 80%, enable a 60 FPS cap, and put all graphics to medium. This should provide 60 FPS throughout most of the game, if we ignore the opening chapter, and the only time it dropped after this was in the sewers chapter, when being chased by the Zerks. If you put Metal Effects to 70%, it will improve the FPS in the scene, but I don't want to go any lower than this, as Metal Effects has a massive negative effect on the visual quality in Stray due to spatial upscaling. This iMac only reached a max temperature of 43 degrees, which is great to see. Now it's time to look at my Mac Mini with M2 Pro. At 1080p medium, the opening chapter of Stray on this Mac Mini provides about 50 FPS. After this chapter, it can sometimes be over 100 FPS. Really good performance. Here later on in the rooftops or the sewers chapter, it's about 80 to 100 FPS. You can obviously play well above these settings on this Mac Mini. For example, here is 1440p. To achieve this, put Metal Effects to 80%, enable a 60 FPS cap, and put all graphics to high. This provides 60 FPS throughout most of gameplay if we ignore the opening of the game. And another issue arises when in the sewers chapter, going into the low 50s when being chased by the Zerks. Lowering metal effects helps if you want closer to a completely locked 60 FPS, but the visual quality is not nearly as good. There was also a weird memory leak issue on this Mac, if you want to call it that. For example, when I was playing in the sewers, you may have noticed the memory usage was 16 to 17 gigabyte. I then restarted the game and it went down to 8 gigabyte of memory usage. And it's worth noting, Stray was the only application open on this Mac at the time of this recording. This Mac Mini also reached a max temperature of 44 degrees, which is pretty good. Our last Mac to look at is my MacBook Pro 14-inch with M3 Max. At 1080p medium, the game sees about 70 FPS in the first chapter of the game. After this, it will jump well over 100 FPS. You can obviously play well above these settings too. For example, here is 2160p 4K high with metal effects disabled. The problem you're going to face with this machine is major throttling. It will be about 40 to 60 FPS for most of gameplay, which is not terrible, I suppose, but it is seeing worse performance than my 16-inch MacBook Pro with M2 Max, and it isn't really much better than my 16-inch MacBook Pro with M1 Max. I think a main reason for this is because the 14-inch model is just not suited for the 40-core GPU, and this machine just doesn't have as good thermal management compared to the 16-inch models. So I did another test with my massive fan blowing wind against this M3 Max machine, and it dramatically improved performance. It's also worth noting that on this machine, the max temperature was a little over 50 degrees, so it does get hot, whereas my other M1 and M2 Max machines were, 45, 44 degrees, so yeah. So there we have it, Stray on Mac. It's, it's an interesting port. I kind of like to think of it like my childhood cat, who I didn't get along well with my cat Cougar, who is now dead, and we didn't see eye to eye. But in a way, I loved Cougar, and Cougar was a part of my family, even though he would hide under a table and run out and hit me and slash my face and stuff like that. I still, at the end of the day, I loved him.
They're both on the bed and they're having a great time together.
And that is like Stray. For example, I don't see eye to eye with Stray's Mac performance and bugs, but I'm still so happy this amazing story game is now a part of the Mac gaming family. I strongly recommend that you try out this game. Even with all the performance issues and bugs, I still reckon that you should check it out because of the graphics. It's a good showcase of Unreal Engine, good showcase of good storytelling that can be on Mac, and it's just also good to support indie games that come to Mac and a native at the end of the day. That's all I really have to say. I hope you enjoyed the video. See ya.
The name's Puss Puss. Get used to it. Cougar. You're the most sweetest thing I've ever seen. Oh God. Oh God.